Guten Tag und willkommen. This is my Oktoberfest 2024 video. Prost. So, for Oktoberfest 2024, we're going to talk about Grimm's Fairy Tales by the brothers Grimm, Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm. These are probably the most famous catalogers of fairy tales in the world, though there's other catalogers and other writers of fairy tales. Hans Christian Andersen is probably second most famous. But the Brothers Grimm is really where it's at. These are the big boys in terms of fairy tales. And what the Grimms basically did was a sort of proto-ethnography almost, or proto-anthropology. They were cultural historians, essentially. So they went around and they collected folk tales from common people in Germany, and they recorded versions of them. Now, most people know a lot of the Grimm's fairy tales. But, interestingly enough, oftentimes the stories that people think that they know are not really the stories that the Grimms give us. They're in some ways substantially different, and I think that's one of the things that sort of most surprised me about reading these stories. So I'll give you a couple of examples. We'll start with a big one. Everybody knows Cinderella, right? That's a famous story. Disney did a version of it, and everybody thought it was fucking amazing. It's a Brothers Grimm's fairy tale, right? Not quite. The Cinderella story apparently goes back as early as Strabo, who was a sort of, I think, 1st century CE Greek cartographer and historian. It's actually not in the Brothers Grimm, but there's a different version of it. We don't have Cinderella, we have Aschenputtel. Same basic logic to the name, actually. Cinderella gets the name Cinderella because her wicked stepmother makes her work in the cinders. Aschenputtel gets the name Aschenputtel because her wicked stepmother makes her work in the ashes. They're similar stories, but it's a different version of it. And that's not a major change. I mean, the character name is different, but the character name is the character name, and that's all there is to that. There's some other differences, none of which are really major necessarily, but they're differences from the version that I think most people think that they know. One is that we don't have a glass slipper. We have instead a golden slipper. Okay, fine. That doesn't make any real difference. It's similar enough that it's all sort of above board there. We also don't have a fairy godmother. In fact, there's no fairy godmother in this entire collection of stories. And I don't know that this version, this is a Doubleday version without a copyright date on it. But in this book, there's no fairy godmother whatsoever in any of the stories. Instead, Aschenputtel has her wishes granted by a magical tree and birds. So there's this bit where Aschenputtel's dad, who apparently doesn't care that his beloved daughter is forced to work as a lowly servant, he goes to this fancy fair or whatever, and he asks all three of the children, Aschenputtel and the two wicked stepsisters, what they want. The two stepsisters are like, fancy stuff, gems and nice clothes and whatever. Just fucking material bullshit. Aschenputtel is like, bring me the first twig that touches your hat on the way back from the fair. So a hazel twig touches his hat on the way back from the fair. He snaps it off, brings it to her. She plants it in her dead mother's grave. Apparently, it then grows into a hazel tree. That I don't think is how hazel twigs work. I don't think that they are I don't think that hazel trees are something you can take a cutting off of, replant it, and get a new tree. But you know what? I don't know from botany. And Aschenputtel comes to her mother's grave 3 times a day to weep and pray, and each time she does, a magical bird comes out of this hazel twig/tree with the power to grant her wishes. So that's how she gets dresses to go to the ball, etc., etc. Another one, and this is slightly more of an actual real divergence from the story that people know or think they know, is in The Frog Prince, right? Because the story that I think most people, at least in the US, hear is that the princess has to, in some way or another, kiss this frog that transforms him back into a magical prince. No, not in Brothers Grimm. Ain't no frog kissing in this story. So basically, the frog gets the princess's ball out of a well, and she's sort of useless, but she agrees that she will have him as her companion and let him eat at the table with her and sleep in her bed and hang out with her all the time. Then she gets her ball. She doesn't want to do any of this. The king is like, hey, you promised, so you got to do it. So the frog basically forces her to let him be in her bed. And it says here, then she felt beside herself with rage, and picking him up, she threw him with all her strength against the wall, crying, now will you be quiet, you horrid frog. But as he fell, he ceased to be a frog and became all at once a prince with beautiful, kind eyes. And it had come to pass that with her father's consent they became bride and bridegroom. There's more to it. But rather than kissing this frog to turn him back into a prince, she literally chucks it against the wall. And that, for some reason, breaks the spell. Weird. Don't know why. That is very odd. And that's not the only odd thing that happens in these stories. So one odd thing that happens is how quickly the stories often go from relatively wholesome to fucking insane. So the Goose Girl is a good example of this. In the Goose Girl, okay, so actually the Goose Girl is insane throughout, but it gets totally bonkers right at the end. So basically, in the Goose Girl, you have this princess, she gets a handmaiden, and her mother gives her a handkerchief with 3 drops of her mother's blood on it. This is like the supplies she set out with to go and marry this prince in this other realm. The princess wants a drink of water from this stream a couple of times, and the handmaiden is like, yeah, no, I'm not doing that. You get your own drink of water. So basically, she's not doing what a handmaiden is supposed to do. The princess is like, well, I don't know how to respond to this, so I guess I'm going to get my own drink of water. She then... Sorry, my cat's automatic litter scoop is going. I don't know if the mic is going to pick that up. But basically, she ends up losing her handkerchief with her mother's blood on it in the river and doesn't notice. And apparently that means the handmaiden is now, in command. So the handmaiden forces this princess to switch clothes with her, and is basically like, I will kill you if you tell them at the castle that I'm the handmaid and you're the princess. So the princess is like, yeah, okay, we'll go with that. Also, she has a talking horse. And so they get to the castle. The handmaid, in the guise of the princess, is like, I'm going to marry this prince now. And and she's like, send this chick here off to do some work so I don't ever have to look at her. Have this horse killed. The princess, the actual princess, bribes the guy who's going to kill the horse not to leave the horse alive, but to hang up the horse's head in a gate that she has to walk through every day. And the horse's head keeps talking even though it's been decapitated. And basically they have the same conversation when she leaves the castle and when she comes back in, where she's like, hey, horse, is your head hanging up here? And he's like, oh, princess, if your mother could see you now, it would break her heart. It's over and over and over, same conversation. See, this is nuts throughout. But again, it will get more bonkers right at the end. So eventually the king, realizes that something is amiss, and he calls in this girl, who's now the goose girl, because she's charged with watching the geese, and he's like, tell me what is going on. And she's like, I can't say. And so he's like, all right, tell it to this iron oven. So she gets in this oven and tells the whole thing that occurred. And the king is just sitting outside the oven being like, yep, I knew it. So he gets her really fancy dress and gets her all fucking dolled up and shit and brings her in. And the handmaid apparently just doesn't recognize her at all. So he brings her into this feast or whatever, and the king then proceeds to be like, hey, handmaid, who's, again, remember, pretending to be the princess and who's apparently married to his son, he's like, what do you think should be done if somebody does this exact sequence of events that the handmaid did? And she apparently forgot that she did all that stuff because she is like, so he says, now what doom does such a one deserve? And she says, no better than this, answered the false bride, that she be put naked into a cask, studded inside with sharp nails, and be dragged along in it by 2 white horses from street to street until she be dead. Wow, all of a sudden we've gone from, here's a weird story about magical horse heads and princesses getting dispossessed, which happens all the time in these stories, by the way, to here's some brutal torture. And the king is like, thou hast spoken thy own doom. So basically that is what happens. That is the end of the story. All of a sudden we just go from all right, how is the princess gonna get out of this without ever actually just telling people this is what happened, to this handmaid is now going to be brutally killed in this really, really sort of barbaric medieval torture type fashion. Another thing that's weird and uncomfortable about a lot of this is the role of fathers. Because there's a lot of stories here with wicked stepmothers. And typically there is a dad, but the dad just disappears, basically. So in The Three Little Men in the Wood, there's a really good example of this. Because we start with these 2 families. One has a widower, and the other has a widow. So they could get married. The man is not sure. So he says to his beloved daughter, take this boot, it has a hole in the sole. Go up with it into the loft, hang it on the big nail, and pour water in it. If it holds water, I shall once more take to me a wife. If it lets out the water, so will I not. I don't know what manner of decision-making process this is, but she hangs his boot with a hole in it in the loft, pours water into it, the water does not come out. So he gets married to this woman. Then he's fucking gone, right? So this woman, the new stepmother, had promised to treat his daughter better than her own daughter. That goes on for a day. Then she treats them the same the second day. Then she starts treating her own daughter substantially better the third day. And, like, it gets real abusive. And again, this is very common in these stories. And Dad is just completely absent. He is not here at all. Like, he does not ever show back up in the story. And I get on the one level that, like, in order to have the virtuous and beautiful daughter abused by the wicked stepmother, you can't have Dad showing up and being like, stop abusing my daughter. But it seems like a big plot hole.